Very special thanks once again to Cars of Somerset for providing the AMG in this review, and as always I've linked to their website, their current stock in particular, down in the video description. So of course if you're looking for something like this, maybe even this exact car, or looking for them to source a vehicle for you, which they also offer, then of course click that link and check out what they've currently got. The AMG GT, or in this particular form the GTS Edition 1 with the extra stripe pack and the carbon fibre detailing, is a car where I actually had to think for a while in terms of how to best describe who this is for, because the car is certainly not what I was expecting, but not necessarily in a bad way. In fact, I think for the right driver, this car may even be their favourite vehicle they've ever owned. But for some other people who might be expecting something more Mercedes, you might not like it as much as you're hoping. So let's get into why. Now, anyone who's familiar with my reviews knows I'm going to talk about potential issues that these cars can have, fuel economy, performance, even interior space, so of course stick around for all of that. And as I always say, if you are or were an owner of one of these, doesn't have to be the GTS, could be the GT or the GTR, tell me your experience down below, also for the benefit of those reading the comments. Your past history, maybe some issues you had. And in particular, I would love to hear about what those issues were, because spoiler alert, I was not able to find many significant issues at all online. Now, I'm sure there are people who have documented that, but typically for most cars that you look up, even good ones or expensive ones, there tend to be one or two commonalities that most cars will have, especially in the case of this one, for instance, being from 2015, that's more than enough time to have a backlog of issues, and the fact that they're hard to find is a very good sign. Now again, I'm sure the car can have its issues, but my general advice for looking for one of these for sale, GTS or otherwise, is make sure you find a car that's clearly been loved. And it's not too difficult to see that. Look at the condition of the interior, the condition of the bodywork, even under the body, perhaps even more so than the exterior on top. Check the wheels. Have they been curbed, for instance? Because you're not looking necessarily to see if the car has been ragged, because of course it's designed to be driven quickly. You're looking for a car that's been disrespected, because those are two very different things. If somebody's, for instance, gone through a ton of potholes at way too high a speed or curbed it every time they park, that's not a good sign. Everyone can make a mistake, but if it looks like the car has had a pattern of that, you might want to avoid it. Look also for a good service history. And you may be thinking, again, if you're a fan of beards and cars, well, hang on a second, you've said before you don't think that much of service histories. That's true, but it depends on the car. I mostly mean that in terms of 2000s and prior vehicles. I believe the MOT history is far more valuable to check a car's history than the servicing, but from a car of this era or onward, like the past, say, 7 years, 2015 and onward, well, this is a pretty good time to look into that service history because it's a much newer vehicle. Now, in terms of what you can expect to pay, obviously there are multiple different versions of the AMG GT, standard model with about 460 horsepower. This one, we'll get into the specs in just a second. Obviously you've got the GTR, you've got the convertible. There was a facelift in 2017, since this particular one is one of the early cars from 2015, and at the time of releasing this video, they still sell them now. So the prices can vary wildly. If you keep it away from the GTR though, so just the GT or the GTS, then you're looking at about 50 up into about 80 or sometimes even 90 grand. So it's a fairly wide window, but for most of the pre-facelift cars, you're going to be looking at about 50 to 65,000. Now for that, first of all, you get an engine which is pretty different to what you typically expect. Instead of the typical approach of large capacity, almost American style supercharged or naturally aspirated V8s with big lazy torque and relatively low rev power, Mercedes actually opted to do something a little bit more fancy. It's a much smaller 4 litre, so an interesting number to be working with. Not too many cars on the market with that kind of capacity to start with. It's a V8 still, A twin turbo though, that's an interesting change for Mercedes, and obviously it gives you great advantages in efficiency, of course power as well, and in this form you're looking at really good numbers. 503 horsepower, some say 510, 515, and 480 pound-feet of torque. Really, really solid numbers to be working with, especially, and this is the interesting part, when the car itself is actually lighter than one of, I would say, the best examples of a lightweight GT, the Jag XK. The Jag XK, or even the XKR with the aluminium body, such as my era, is pretty good on weight. It's about 1665 kilos. This is more like 1645. However, this of course is much more like the F-Type in terms of just having two seats, regardless of if it's the coupe or the convertible. Now, speaking of that hardtop version, one of the things that I always, of course, discuss in these videos, because it's kind of important to me to be able to drive it in the first place, is the space. Is the headroom good? Is the legroom good? What's the general feel of the cabin like? Now, to me, I would put this into a very similar camp, funnily enough, to one of my favourite cars of last year, the Jaguar XFR. Stunning car, absolutely loved it, as many of you will know, but here's the interesting thing. For somebody of my height and build at least, there are certain cars which fit me perfectly. I would describe them as snug. They're not tight, they're not cramped, but they're not endlessly spacious. They're just right for me. A car which feels like you're almost wearing the vehicle rather than sitting in it. And to me, this has that exact vibe, and I love it. It felt really cool. It actually gave off a very supercar vibe, wherein the headroom was more than good enough for me, but at the same time you're looking out of this almost World War II pillbox windshield, which gives a really like race car vibe with a long bonnet and very little behind you, almost like you're sitting over the rear wheels, kind of Gillett Vertigo style. And I think it suits the car. This is much more of a pure brute sports car than it is a GT. And that brings me to the kind of person who might enjoy one. See, I believe this car, in terms of not the looks or necessarily the spec, but just how it feels, how it corners, and how it delivers its performance, is very much so the modern interpretation of what you might look for in, for instance, a 90s TVR, like a Cerberus or a Chimera. Or, if you go even further back to the 60s, something like a Shelby Cobra. However, unlike those, this benefits from all of the kind of modern advances and improvements that those cars never had. In the case of the TVR, this is more reliable, has better engineering and build quality. Compared to the Cobra, of course, this has more creature comforts and is, funnily enough, a lot more affordable, but it very much delivers that kind of experience. And that was the thing that surprised me the most, because most of the other fast Mercs that I've driven, and have been fairly varied so far in age and power and performance, they do have a similar-ish vibe, as you'd expect. This one doesn't. This is very different to the other Mercs that I drove. It actually feels like it does nothing for you. It feels really analog, and that was surprising for such a new car. Now, some people will love that. I think the issue might come in where, if you're a traditional Mercedes owner, you might find this a little bit different to what you're expecting. This doesn't feel anywhere near the gentleman's driver car that I thought it was going to be. I was expecting a very Jaguar-esque experience. It isn't at all. In fact, it's much more like something from Italy. And that is an interesting choice for Mercedes to take. And I think some people will love it, and some people won't, because this car steps its tail out very easily. It has a huge amount of torque, which spins up those rear wheels very easily, and even though technically you've got some electronic aids, it actually doesn't feel like it. It feels pretty raw and brutal. And although a lot of petrol heads throw around those terms as if that's the best thing since sliced bread, I think for some owners that might actually put you off, especially potentially older buyers. If you're in your, 50s, 60s, 70s, you may find it a little bit too playful or too brutal. You might actually prefer something like a 911 or a Jag that's just that tad more restrained, especially when they have advantages like all-wheel drive. In the case of this one, it has a distinctly youthful feel, which I like, of course, but at the same time, it's an interesting choice compared to their typical target audience. And just to highlight the brutality of this car's performance even more, that 500 horsepower engine in the about 1645 kilo body, with incidentally a 7-speed auto, of course with paddles as well, put it in race mode, you have to use the paddles exclusively, etc. Rear-wheel drive only with an electronic limited slip diff. Again, it's got everything you would want, all those kind of buzzwords. The 0 to 60 is quoted at about 3.5 seconds, with a top speed of up around 200 miles an hour. And in case you're wondering if that's accurate, well, Car and Driver tested one. They actually got it to do 0 to 60 in 3 seconds dead. Now, from 500 horsepower without all-wheel drive, that's very fast. And the top speed they tested was 193. So not exactly lacking. Certainly more than fast enough to worry stuff like Italian or British, for instance, sports cars and GTs. The handling on it is super playful, but as I said, very much so does not hold your hand. It kind of technically must be, but it sure doesn't feel like it. Again, respect to the AMG engineers for making a car that can feel like that, but again, it certainly won't be to everyone's tastes. It may be a little bit too brutish or brutal or muscular for some people's tastes, but if you're into that, then it definitely offers that in spades. In terms of stuff like fuel economy, daily use, again, I know a lot of people won't care, but I always like to talk about that kind of stuff just to see how cars compare. It's rated at some surprisingly good numbers. 23 miles per gallon in the city, 36 on the highway, and an average of 30. Those are really, really strong numbers for a car that can do 0 to 60 in 3 seconds dead. The reality, though, seems a little bit more murky. Now, I've mentioned, for instance, aggregator sites to find out real fuel economy before, but it was kind of difficult to find a consensus for this one. Most GT owners, it would seem, report more like 16 to the gallon, which is way lower than what they quote, even in the city. I wasn't able to find numbers specifically for the S, but if it is roughly the same, about 16, combined with the 85-litre tank, which is 18.7 gallons in the UK, you're looking at about 300 miles of range. And again, although a lot of owners of these, if you're paying 60 grand, you probably don't care about the miles per gallon too much, but again, it's nice to know that a car has been well engineered. When I was driving the car, I put 20 pounds of fuel in there, and that gave me about 100 miles. So again, not bad for what it is. Not necessarily the best thing around, but certainly more than adequate for a 500 horsepower, borderline 200 mile an hour sports car. Now, to return to the aspect of it being not really like what you'd expect from a Mercedes, one of the things which was very different to what you might expect is the ride. It certainly isn't as smooth or as comfortable as you may expect a Mercedes to be. Now, you could argue, and I would actually agree with this argument, that it's not supposed to be a traditional Mercedes. That's the whole point. It is more brutal, more hardcore, and far more playful and aggressive. All of that is 100% true. The thing that impressed me the most about the suspension and the steering is actually how neutral it is through corners. Because yes, you can step the tail out, but there is no body roll, and I mean none. This car does not bend or flex at all through corners. It feels almost like you're driving this kind of 60s or 70s like club sport weekend racer, borderline race car on the road sometimes, and that's a very cool experience to have. Again, it's just belying the way the car looks and the way you'd expect it to feel compared to how it actually does. My overall thoughts on the GT then are actually that this is a deceptively complex car. When you first drive it, it seems simple. It delivers a lot of what you'd want, but some of what you might not expect this car to be capable of. But I think that's both its biggest strength and its biggest weakness, because it's a strong point in terms of being this very refreshingly old school approach at delivering performance. But at the same time, because it's not what you're expecting, it might put some potential buyers off because it might not be what they wanted from the car. For instance, if you've previously owned an SL, for example, well, this is nothing like an SL, I can tell you that. And even though something like a black edition may compare, most owners probably aren't going from a black edition to an AMG GTS. So again, it's a difficult car to pigeonhole down into one exact kind of buyer, but I would categorize it as having a distinctly youthful vibe compared to what I would have expected. It feels like a car developed for people in their late 20s to 30s in particular. It's got that kind of performance and feel. And as you heard at the start of the video, when you put it up into Sport Plus or race mode, it sounds pretty fantastic as well. It's not that an older person couldn't or wouldn't enjoy this car, it's just I think it might be a little bit over the top for some people like that. If you're in the market for something that is this kind of level, but maybe a little bit more forgiving and a little bit more of a long distance approach, then you may want to look toward a Jag, maybe a Maserati Gran Turismo, something like that. But overall, that's it for this particular review. As I said, tell me your thoughts down below, and of course, if you want to check out more reviews, click the playlist here on screen to see all of my others, and stick around obviously on the channel for more in future. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.